Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm aiming to set the scene with a look at what balanced decision making is, so that we can then begin to unravel the implications of the digital revolution in healthcare. So let's start with what is the right decision? Well, I think we have to think about what Einstein said about time and think about if we have to question whether time exists, I think we have to question whether rightness exists for decisions. And I think we must accept that we cannot just go to the outcome to look and see whether a decision was right. If we're thinking about financial decisions, we may get wealthy as the result of a decision, but that might have just been lucky. Or think about healthcare decisions. A healthcare decision can have an adverse outcome. So for me, for example, at my age, I regard it as a right, quote, in quotes, decision to have been vaccinated. But if I was to die of a thrombosis tomorrow, that doesn't make it a wrong decision. So outcomes are rather poor indicators. And we have perhaps to turn to one of the other greats, Jean-Paul Sartre and the existentialists, to think about decisions being judged not at the time by their result, but by the process. And basically, we can only look at the process for decision making to decide whether that was robust and effective. So I think in terms of right process, there are three areas we should look at in detail. We should look at balanced expertise, the way in which we draw on external sources in our decision making, and whether the approach is nuanced enough for the individual decision in progress. Let's look at each of those in turn. So in terms of balanced expertise, we are looking perhaps in the individual consultation at balancing the trained clinical scientist and whether they can bring both experience and expertise, and at the balance between them and the patients who are experts on their own condition. We need to look again at the drawing on external sources. And so for the scientist, that might mean looking at guidelines and protocols. And perhaps, especially for the patient, it might mean looking at the external sources of religion or some such. Let's also think about the nuanced approaches. By this, I mean that we are thinking about the question under evidence of the intuition, which can be regarded as a knowledge that we don't know we have, and looking at the resistance, which is an example of where the resistance can be incredibly valuable. If we find someone who is resistant to change, if we can explore that resistance in a non-threatening way, we can often make much more progress. So, balanced decision-making is a balance between people and needs to avoid power games. It's also a balance between evidence and values. And I'm going to come on to those a bit. It's also, we need to look at how we can work when evidence conflicts and when values conflict. So first of all, the balancing between the people. I think and believe that we've moved past much of the days of medical paternalism, but still there are occasions when evidence can be used as, rather than as an aid, as a hammer to hit the patient. I would cite as an example when the Royal College of Obstetricians felt they had to intervene because too many obstetricians were saying to patients, you can't have a cesarean section because the evidence doesn't support it. And it was down to the college to point out that values also are an influence, and that if someone had a profound belief that they wanted a non-dangerous procedure, that must be taken into account. On the other side, there's what Bill Fulford calls anything goes. This is where clinicians have moved so far away from paternalism that they abdicate their responsibility in the decision-making process. You choose, up to you, over to you. The belief I hold is that clinicians have a responsibility to make their experience and their expertise available to patients. So there is also the balance between evidence and values. We talk about the 2 feet principle, that evidence and values are both of equal importance in decision making. But crucially, we need to remember that both the clinician and the patient bring their evidence and their values. And it's important to remember that the clinician doesn't leave their values behind. They are in that room, and clinicians need to be trained in self-awareness to think about how they're in that room. Evidence and values I've talked about as though they're separate. They're not. Our values are also the lens through which we view evidence. So we may think about the evidence from our mum because she is such a strong influence on us. Or we may say, well, the weight of social media says this. Or we may cite the Cochrane collaboration. All these are demonstrating the lens through which we view our evidence. And we must also remember that our values are shaped by our own personal evidence in our own lives. So we may be aware, or maybe tacitly aware, of ways, behaviors which have kept us safe in the past. And that may imbue them with a tremendous importance in our lives, and perhaps subconsciously we can return to those behaviors, sometimes maladaptively, and that is because our personal evidence is so strong within us. So I think we're at a point where we should challenge evidence and explore values, but we should do both with respect. A basic premise of values-based practice is respect for the diversity of values. And one of the things we learned very early on in working with values-based practice is that we need to emphasize that nobody needs to change their values when we have values-based consultations. It was really the clinicians who, when we explored the resistance that some of them had to going there in terms of values, it was as though they were frightened that their own personal citadel of values might be under threat as soon as they went there. When we explained that it's not about changing values, there's no evangelism in values-based practice, it became easier to bring the values explicitly into consultations. One of the important things that we learn is how to focus on the values in common more than the values that differ, and to decide on a course of action that's acceptable for now, It doesn't have to be for all time. So to the bottom line, balanced decision-making takes account of the relevant evidence and it builds on a shared framework of values. Just a word on conflict. Conflicting evidence and conflicting values need different processes. When it comes to evidence, we're aiming for consensus. We look and see and discuss and challenge the evidence, and if we find a need to change practice, we will do. But when values are in conflict, we need a different process, and that process is called dissensus. And it's more than just agreeing to disagree. It recognizes the difference in our values. And again, it's about finding a balance for this particular situation. Important to remember, there are no winners, no losers. The respect is all. We should say that values-based practice extends beyond the consultation room of one individual consultation, and it goes into the whole of the way the care teams operate. And here we operate in fusion, and because that's the way we work, at Warwick, when we were designing the digital healthcare science course, we tried to model the learning on the interwoven strands that clinicians employ: digital health science, physiological science, behavioral science, clinical decision-making science, professional development. All are part and parcel and all depend on the same decision-making processes, balanced if possible. So that's just a brief run through of what I see as the important points of balanced clinical decision-making. I've got some questions to frame our discussions perhaps later on. How far can we go with personalization? Because there are an awful lot of people around, and how can we deal with all the individuals we have to deal with? Is digital going to be helpful or hindrance in this respect? Are algorithms values biased? When you think about the algorithms that on which NHS 111 is based, they are perhaps very biased towards safety. Yet in our discussions and our learning on the courses, when we think about risk and choice, we find that people's attitudes towards safety are very, very different. Can this be taken into account as algorithms get more and more advanced? And does the binary override the nuances, or can it learn to be more nuanced? Is there a danger that as we move more and more into digital clinic working, that we will be ignoring patient or clinician intuition, and that we will be failing to explore resistance? Those are just a few questions that I'd like to leave you with as thoughts as we move forward.